Hi, Spencer. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
What do you want to tell us?
I'd like to start with my parents. They died when I was a very young age. My dad, in the war, World War II, he was a pilot off of a carrier, aircraft carrier. He flew a Hellcat, and he went on a mission over the Palau Islands, and they never saw his plane after that. They went back and searched for him a couple of times, couldn't find it, but maybe they found it now because they've found a lot of planes beneath the ocean and they're taking DNA samples. For this reason, I'm sending my DNA sample to the U.S. Navy, and they have sent me a kit to see if they have the remains of my father now, because
What
it's been
was
recently that they've found these planes.
what was the names?
My name originally was Spencer Eugene Hamblin. My father was Len Spencer Hamblin, and he was an officer in the Navy. He flew a Hellcat. That was the plane he flew off the carrier. My mom was a little small town girl. Laramie, Wyoming wasn't that big, but that's mainly where she grew up. And he met her, I'm not even sure where they met, but they were at the University of Wyoming when they got engaged. And I was born, they got married before he went overseas. And I was born in 1943, July 5th of 1943, and by that time he was off fighting in the war. Um, my mom, she was kind of disowned by her father, my grandpa Ferguson. Her name was Margaret Eileen Ferguson, and she went to my grandpa Hamblin's farm for a while, but also went up to Montana, and that's where I was born. She went up there with a friend because my dad was off to war. And then when I was born, she came back and we lived in a little log cabin. And I have pictures of all these things, so I'll share them. I only saw my father as a baby on a couple of occasions. I saw him when I was, when, he, well, when my mom and my aunt went down to Florida, Pensacola, Florida, where the naval training station was. And she went down there to uh, uh, to see him. And of course, my one of my uncles was also in that same flight training school. As a matter of fact, three of the Hamblin brothers enlisted and all became pilots and off of different carriers. I think my uncle Lou may have been on the USS Essex. I'm not sure, but anyway, they were very, very active and very pro-American, very patriotic. So the three brothers all were officers and all pilots off of different carriers. And so my Uncle Lou even was involved in the search to try to find remains of the plane or whatever, but was never able to. But to digress somewhat and go back to my mom, it was very hard for her because she was going to have me and she was without her husband. So she went to be with a friend because her father had disowned her. She had become a member of the Mormon church, and he being Irish Catholic, and he always wanted her to be a nun, and she wanted none of that, if you understand what I mean. She wanted to, well, of course, by then she was converted, and she was very, very studious, very devout in studying the scriptures. And my Uncle Whiff, who was a bishop at the time, recalls her coming out while he was milking the cows. And she would ask questions about the Book of Mormon, you know. And that was when she was living in Wyoming. I suppose with me, I was in that little log cabin that you'll have a picture of for this presentation. But I wanted to say that it was very hard for her, but eventually her family accepted her to come back home to Laramie, Wyoming. And she went back there and got involved in school again, I guess. She was at the University of Wyoming at the same time my dad went there, even though he had had 1 year of schooling at Utah State University. I think he transferred evidently to the university there in Wyoming. And they met and were engaged. They met and were engaged at the Institute of Religion there in Laramie. And there's pictures of them at the Institute too. And my uncle Lou and his wife Margaret were very close, and they I think were engaged there too. But anyway, when we lived in that little cabin, it was really a one room cabin with a coal burning stove in one end. That's where they'd do all the cooking. They'd heat the water for baths. We had a running water, a nice little canal running just about 30 feet, 30, 50 feet from the front door of the cabin. And we had an outhouse. Of course, I wasn't much into outhouses by that time. I was still a baby. And anyway, she lived there and then eventually moved on to Wyoming because her dad had softened a bit. And I think that she must have lived with her father and mother there at a time. And both my grandmothers had mental problems. It was a hard time during those years with the war going on, and Grandpa Hamblin and Grandma Hamblin having lost their son at war, and their other two sons gratefully came back home safely and married and had families. Uncle Lou and Uncle Darwin. Anyway, I think when I was there in Wyoming, I ended up going to kindergarten there because my mom was still with me, and she was very active in the LDS church, primary teacher, and things of that nature. I remember a little bit about the church and playing pump, pump, pull away on the front lawn of the church, and different little games that we played. And it was a fun experience, but she ended up meeting another man that had come back from the war himself. He was a prisoner of war in the other continent, in the European theater, where the war was being fought against Hitler. Of course, my original father was fighting against the Japanese, and but Hitler was causing quite a stir there in Europe, and so he was a gunner on an airplane. I think it was a B-17, and they had flown 12 missions and were going on their 13th and final mission. And his plane was shot down by the Germans over Holland. And he bailed out of the plane with his parachute and left his parachute there and ran towards a farmhouse and was able to stay there for a few hours, I suppose. But then the Germans did come knocking on the door of this Dutch family. Were trying to hide not only my father, but for some time they had a Jewish family hiding in the cellar. And of course, it would be certain death if the Germans were to capture that Jewish family. They would be either shot or taken to a prison camp. And so, in order to protect them, he walked out and gave himself up to the Germans because they were looking for him. Frankly, with the parachute, they were able to identify that it was him. And I think there's a museum in that little town called Baflo. I don't know if it means buffalo, but it's called Baflo, Netherlands. A little museum, and they had his parachute. They had one of his electric boots, because on those planes they would have boots were heated with electricity because it was so cold for the feet and everything. And anyway, he injured his back on that, and he suffered with back pains and operations even. He had back surgery when he got back to America. And so he had a long time of suffering with that. Now, what I would like to go now, when we were in kindergarten, my cousin Richard Hopkinson, he was my Aunt Vivian's son, first son, second child, but first son. We lived there together with Aunt Vivian in that cabin. And I think even Aunt Margaret lived there with my cousin Barbara. So there are 3 women and what, 1, 2, 3, 4 children, 4 small children in that little cabin. And I don't know how they did it, because I've gone back and I've looked at that cabin, which barely stands now, if at all. And I have pictures of how it was when we went to a family reunion there. It has a picture of Byron taking a picture of us all in a line with the cabin in the background. And Byron, of course, is my son-in-law that married my daughter, Carrie. And so that was a good experience to see that while it still had some semblance of standing. Well, we were there in that cabin. She would always go there to visit my parents. And she said, if anything ever happens to me, she made my stepfather promise, I want Gene, as he called me. She always called me Gene because I was Eugene, and that's how she knew me, as Spencer Eugene Hamblin. And so she wanted Gene to be able to go and visit his grandfather, Hamblin, back in Wyoming. And of course, he made good on that promise for the most part, I think most summers, except when we were traveling, maybe going to Florida or Tennessee. That was fun to go on those trips with the family. But anyway, back to our experience there in kindergarten, there in Laramie. I had a cousin by the name of Richard, who he and I were going to go to the same kindergarten class, and he was scheduled to go into first grade. But he really wanted to be in class with me, so he dropped back and sacrificed 1 year to be able to be. And then they divided the boundaries or something, and I stayed in that school, but Richard was transferred to another school, or vice versa. I don't know, maybe he remembers, but I don't. But anyway, we were split up. And Richard came to visit Maria and I not too long ago. And he's been an attorney for many, many years up in Worland, Wyoming, up in a prettier part of Wyoming. In some parts of Wyoming, it's just a lot of desert, but they have some mountainous regions which are gorgeous. And he lives up there in Worland, and he's been an attorney, prosecuting attorney, I think, but mostly a public defender since he's been there. And I have a lot of fond memories because during the summers, Richard would come down, we'd play in Grandpa's farm. There were a lot of trees. We built a tree house. And in that tree house, we would run away with maybe a portion of Grandma's chocolate cake that she took out of the oven. And we'd take cans of cherries from her storage, her pantry, that she'd put up canning. And we'd go out and eat those with a spoon out of the can. And a lot of fun experience. I had another cousin by the name of Bob Stoddard. And he lived right across the street from Grandpa, so he would play with us a lot too. We'd play Robin Hood. It was very popular in those days to play Robin Hood. And we made bows out of willows and arrows out of sticks of willows. And sometimes my stepfather would come and visit with my little sister. I didn't talk about my little sister yet, but I'm glancing back to my mother remarried, of course, this man that came back from German prisoner of war. And they had, within 9 months, they had Phyllis, after they were married. And she died about 20 days after that. Complications with the childbirth that she was going through. So I lost my mom when I was 5 years old, and I lost my dad in the war when maybe I was a year and 14 months maybe, or something like that. We can pin those dates down exactly, as we look at the genealogy part of it. But my little sister and I then went, because my father, being single, my stepfather, he wasn't able to keep Phyllis and I at that time, because he was off in another part of Wyoming, working with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And he was primarily working with the fish in the streams, and in factories where they would hatcheries, I guess they called them, where they would put the eggs from the fish, and they'd grow them to a certain size, and then they'd transplant them in the creek, so the fishermen would have something to be able to be able to catch when they went out on the streams. So I remember going there, and that was quite fun to see him at the hatchery doing that kind of work. And his name was Philip Lee Pock, and that's how I came to have the name of Pock, because at the age of 7, he legally adopted me. My name was actually changed, Spencer Eugene Hamblin, to Spencer Eugene Pock. But I've always had a sorrow that my first parents passed away, and I like to keep my ties, my family ties with them as well. And so, but at the age of 6 or so, I was in school there in Laramie. I guess I was in the first grade by then, or maybe I was still in kindergarten. And I'm getting the voice here. That's all right. It's okay. Anyway, the thought I had, we went to live with my uncle and aunt for a year, my sister Phyllis and I, with my Uncle Harold and Aunt Margaret. That was Dad's oldest brother, my stepfather's oldest brother, and his wife, Margaret. They were good people. I really enjoyed being with them, and he was pretty smart. He was an engineer, I think, Uncle Harold. And we lived in a little town called Boysen Dam, Wyoming. So just lived there a year. And by then my father had been introduced to a lady called Betty. And that was to be my stepmother. She fell in love with me at school before she even met my dad. And so she wanted to meet him, and did, because he had changed his church affiliation. Even though he had never been a Mormon, he then became a Methodist, and he changed his church affiliation back to Methodist. That's how he grew up, was as a Methodist. And that's where he met my mom, Betty Jane Turner. And anyway, they decided to get married, and at the age of 7, I believe, I was 7 or 8, my dad and I traveled across the country from Wyoming in a Studebaker, black Studebaker, all the way to Tennessee. And that was a fascinating trip for me. And I was the ring bearer at their wedding. And I remember that trip, especially a couple of things. The cardinals were beautiful. I saw them along the clotheslines as we would go up there, on a pretty bright red bird. and so I was so happy with that. And another thing, when we stayed at my aunt's house, my aunt um, Catherine, and she had a big piece of land there with trees in the backyard, and she had a son, a couple of sons, but one was just a little older than me. And we go back there and catch fireflies. Do you have fireflies, Columbia? Okay, we'd catch them in jars. That was a fun thing. That's something a kid like that would remember, And I was at that age where it was very fascinating because I'd never seen fireflies in Wyoming, Colorado. So I, my stepfather was continuing his education, and he was going to be a teacher. Betty Jane Turner, my new mom, was already a teacher. And so they had moved to Climax to take a job there, Climax, Colorado. And they sent me while they got settled and got a place to live and everything. My parents were teaching school, and they left me with my grandpa Hamblin so that I could go on with my schooling. So I went to my first year of fourth grade there in Mountain View, Wyoming, where my dad had graduated. My first dad had graduated. He went to that school all of his life. And he was a prominent person in the community. Everybody loved him. He was a basketball player, a wrestler, and he was a star about everything he did athletically. As a matter of fact, on the USS Essex, they had set up kind of a competition, kind of an Olympic-style competition. He came out in first place among all of the midshipmen aboard the ship, all of the Navy people. And so he was, I don't know, I didn't get much of that athleticism as my father had. My mother evidently was a pretty fast little runner. My grandpa Hamblin said she could go out in a herd of sheep and they'd start running wildly and she could catch one. And he hadn't been accustomed to having people being able to do that. So she was very fast, very quick. And it's very, very fun thing I learned about him much after she passed on. But anyway, it was a sad day at her funeral. And here I am skipping around because these thoughts come in helter-skelter into my mind. But she died in Laramie, Wyoming, and was buried there at the cemetery. And I've been there just once or twice, and I've taken a picture of her gravestone that one of my aunts took me to, along with my wife Jeannie. And so we were able to take a picture of the gravestone. But that was a sad day for me, and I was very, very depressed, I think, for quite a while. And anyway, one of the teachers commented that to my Uncle Harold that when I was going to school up there in Boysen Dam, she said, your stepson, or not your stepson, but your nephew must be very depressed because he draws everything with a black crayon. And so he asked me about it, my uncle did. I told him, well, that was the only crayon I had. So I don't know whether I was that depressed or not, but it was very sad for me. And even now, I am 81 years of age. I still miss my mom and dad, especially my mom, because I knew her for 5 years. My dad, I lost him when I was a baby, about 14 months, and I'd only seen him 2 times. So that's basically taken me up through the 4th grade when I went to school in Mountain View, Wyoming. And then the second half of my 4th grade experience, I went to Climax, Colorado to be with my parents and my sister. And it was only a 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd or 3rd floor. I can't remember. I think it was the 2nd. And so I slept in the kitchen and Had a little bed there, however, a little sofa, about this size without these arms. I slept on that. And had an interesting dream there one night because my grandmother Turner had gone to Switzerland and brought back a Swiss hat with a feather in it. And so I woke up in a nightmare thinking that feather and that hat were attacking me. I remember that. It's kind of a vivid experience from my climax experience. But another thing I remember about climax was it would snow maybe 30 feet of winter. And so it was a lot of snow. It was 11,500 feet above sea level. And at that height, I went to a school, fourth grade there, and we went all the way through my seventh grade experience, I think my seventh grade. And I enjoyed that experience because it was a small school and I was able to participate in sports, in music. I played in the band. I played trumpet in the band, starting, I think, about the fifth grade. And I got to be pretty good on the trumpet. And so I was able to do that. I was in a play called Huck Finn. Oh no, it's called Tom Sawyer. I was the character called Huck Finn, kind of a wild guy that smoked a cob pipe, you know. And of course, we didn't really smoke it on stage or anything. But anyway, he was kind of the wild guy. Everybody admired him because he was free and he could do what he wanted. I don't know how many of you have read Tom Sawyer, but I was in that play. I also was in a wrestling tournament there at that school, and I guess I took second place in my weight division. And I also played basketball. So I liked that school because I could do a lot of things and develop a lot of talents, you know. When I went down, now when we moved down in the seventh grade to Aurora, I had to specialize. So I chose music because I had more experience in that. And I played in the bands, the marching band for the high school, and I played in the jazz band, in the dance band. And then I started to take up an interest in guitar at the age of about 14, and I got a cheap guitar, about $10, down at a pawn shop on Larimer Street in Denver. And that's how I learned for the first while. But then I don't know where I got the money, but I saved up the money and bought an electric guitar, an Epiphone, later. And eventually the picture I have here of my Johnny Smith guitar, which was a very valuable instrument, very valuable. But by then, I went to study with Johnny Smith, who was one of the most famous jazz guitarists in the country at that time, and he had been the conductor for the Garraway Show, I think Steve Allen, and he was well known in the New York television circles and conducted the bands there. And I had the opportunity between my senior year in college to study guitar with him. And I have pictures of that. Anyway, I think that that covers me up through beginning of
We can
college.
leave it for him to. I think that's good enough for
Okay.
the first chapter.
Okay.
You can, obviously we're gonna keep working with you, listening your histories, but for now I think that's gonna be perfect for the first chapter.
And you'll know some of the pictures I'd like integrated.
Actually, we're gonna do it.
Yeah,
Actually, we'll
good.
do it. So thank you for your time, Spencer, and thank you for your history.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. It'll be good to have that. The kids, if nothing else.